Elodie noticed the sleeves before her father did, the way children often notice things adults have trained themselves to politely overlook. Long sleeves in June, long sleeves at the pool party she wasn't allowed to swim at, long sleeves even the afternoon the air conditioning broke, and the whole house sat sweating through a 90-degree day. She never asked about it out loud, not for the first 6 weeks. She just watched, with the quiet, patient attention 3-year-olds sometimes surprise you with, until the day she finally did ask, and the answer changed the way her father understood the woman caring for his daughter every day. This story deals with self-harm and mental health recovery, though I want to be clear up front that you won't hear any details about the harm itself, only what came after it. If this topic is difficult for you, please be gentle with yourself while you watch, and I'll leave some resources at the end. Simon Wexford was 41, the founder of a renewable infrastructure firm outside Minneapolis, and a single father since his wife's death 2 years earlier, a loss that had reshaped nearly every part of his household's daily rhythm. He'd hired Meredith Sawyer as Elodie's new nanny that spring, after a lengthy search that had left him increasingly wary of candidates who seemed polished in interviews and strangely rigid in practice. Meredith had been different from the start, warm without being performative, patient in a way that seemed to come from somewhere genuine rather than trained, the kind of steady presence Simon had found himself relieved by more than he expected to be. He noticed the sleeves too, eventually, though it took him longer than his daughter, and he'd talked himself out of thinking much of it at first. Some people run cold. Some people are simply private about their bodies. He told himself several versions of this over the first month, each one reasonable enough on its own, until the accumulation of small details started to outweigh any single explanation. Here's the thing about paying quiet attention to someone without prying, which is exactly what Simon chose to do, and I think it's worth naming clearly, because it's the whole shape of how this story unfolds. He didn't ask Meredith directly. He didn't look into her background beyond the standard reference checks any responsible parent runs before hiring someone to care for their child. He simply made sure, in small, consistent ways, that his household was an easy place to exist in. No pressure, no scrutiny, no questions that weren't freely offered. It was Elodie, in the end, who asked the question Simon had spent weeks deliberately not asking. They were in the garden on a warm Saturday afternoon, Elodie digging in a small patch of dirt Meredith had set aside for her, when Elodie looked up and asked, with the same unfiltered directness Simon had come to expect from her at this age, "Why do you always wear the long shirt? Aren't you hot?" Meredith's hands went still over the soil for a moment. Simon, sitting nearby with his laptop mostly forgotten in his lap, felt himself tense slightly, unsure whether to intervene. "I am a little hot sometimes," Meredith said carefully, kneeling down to Elodie's level. "I wear long sleeves because there are some marks on my arms from a hard time in my life, and I'm not quite ready for everyone to see them yet. Is that okay?" Elodie considered this with the particular seriousness small children bring to information they don't fully understand but sense matters. "Okay," she said simply, and went back to digging, entirely satisfied with an answer that would have taken most adults considerably longer to accept without further questions. Simon, watching from a few feet away, found himself moved by something in that exchange he couldn't immediately name. Not the content of it exactly, but the honesty, the way Meredith had chosen truth over deflection even with a 3-year-old, and the quiet dignity with which she'd asked for time, rather than pretending the question hadn't landed anywhere. It was another 3 weeks before Meredith brought it up with Simon directly, on an evening she'd stayed later than usual to finish preparing for a work trip he had coming up. "I want to explain something," she said, standing in his kitchen doorway with the same careful posture Simon recognized now as the posture of someone about to say something they'd rehearsed more than once in their own head. "In case Elodie ever asks you the same thing she asked me." "You don't owe me an explanation," Simon said, "but I'm glad to listen if you want to share one." Meredith sat down across from him at the kitchen island. "I went through a very hard period, about 4 years ago now," she said, "after my daughter was born. I'd struggled with depression on and off since I was a teenager, and it came back harder than I'd ever experienced it. Badly enough that I hurt myself, more than once, during the worst of it. I was hospitalized for a short time. I got real help after that, therapy, medication that actually worked for me, and I've been stable for over 3 years now. But the marks are still there, and I'm not always ready for people to see them and immediately assume they know the whole story just from looking. I want to pause here because I think it matters how Meredith told this. She didn't tell it like a confession she was ashamed of. She told it like a fact about her own history, difficult but fully hers, delivered with the same steady composure she brought to every other part of her work in that house. I think that composure is worth noticing, because it would be easy, telling a story like this one, to make her sound fragile. She wasn't. She'd been showing up every single day, doing careful, attentive work with someone else's grieving 3-year-old for months, while carrying all of this quietly and completely on her own. "There's something else," Meredith said after a moment. "I have a daughter. Her name is Daisy. She's 7. She's been living with my mother-in-law since the hospitalization. It was the right decision at the time. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't in any state to care for a baby that first year, and my mother-in-law stepped in without hesitation. But it's been 3 years since I've been stable, and I still haven't tried to get more time with her." "Why not?" Simon asked, gently. Meredith was quiet for a long moment. "Because some part of me is still convinced that whatever made me hurt myself is still sitting somewhere underneath the stability, waiting. I don't fully trust myself not to fail her again. It feels safer, somehow, to just be the person other people's children get the good version of me, and let Daisy stay somewhere I know for certain she's safe." I don't think there's a tidy response to a sentence like that, and Simon didn't try to offer one that night. What he did instead, over the following weeks, was something smaller and more practical. He asked Meredith, plainly, what kind of support might actually help, rather than assuming he already knew. What Meredith needed, it turned out, wasn't rescue in any dramatic sense. She needed a family reunification therapist, a specialist who works specifically with parents rebuilding relationships with children after a period of separation. Someone whose fees were well beyond what Meredith could comfortably manage on a nanny's salary alongside her existing therapy costs. She needed flexibility in her schedule for court dates and required parenting evaluations, the kind of flexibility most employers are reluctant to offer a relatively new hire. And she needed, more than either of those things, someone to simply believe her assessment of her own stability was trustworthy, rather than treating her history as something that disqualified her from being believed about her present. Simon arranged the first two without much difficulty, covering the cost of a reunification specialist through the same benefit structure his company already used for employee mental health support, and restructuring Meredith's hours around the parenting classes and evaluations the family court required as part of any custody modification. The third thing, the trust, he offered simply by continuing to treat her exactly as he had from the beginning, as someone entirely capable of doing careful, loving work with a child, because that was, after all, exactly what he had watched her do with his own daughter for months. I want to be honest with you about how the custody process actually went, because I don't think this story benefits from pretending it was simple. Meredith's mother-in-law, a woman named Carol, was not a villain in any of this, and I think it matters to say that plainly. Carol had stepped in during the worst period of Meredith's life out of genuine love for Daisy, and her caution about expanding Meredith's access wasn't cruelty. It was the reasonable wariness of someone who had watched Meredith at her lowest point and needed real, sustained evidence before she'd feel safe loosening her grip on a routine that had kept Daisy stable for 3 years. The reunification process took the better part of a year. Supervised visits first, once every 2 weeks, then weekly, then, gradually, unsupervised afternoons, then full weekends. Each step earned through months of consistent, demonstrated stability, rather than granted all at once. There were hard days in that process, Meredith told Simon honestly. Moments in early visits when Daisy was distant or wary, understandably uncertain about a mother she barely remembered as anything but an absence. Meredith kept showing up anyway, the same way she'd shown up every day for Elodie, patient and steady, letting trust rebuild at whatever pace it actually needed, rather than the pace she wished it would take. 14 months after that first conversation in Simon's kitchen, a family court judge granted Meredith joint custody, with Daisy splitting time evenly between her mother's household and her grandmother's, an arrangement Carol herself by that point had come to support without reservation, telling Meredith at the final hearing that she'd never once doubted Meredith's love for Daisy, only her own readiness, and that watching the last year unfold had put that particular fear entirely to rest. Meredith still wears long sleeves most days, though not every day anymore. She still works for Simon, part-time now, adjusted around her custody schedule, and Elodie still occasionally asks about her arms, questions Meredith answers now, with a little more ease each time, the particular ease of someone who's stopped needing the story to stay entirely private in order to feel safe. If there's something worth taking from this one, it's that recovery doesn't erase what happened, and it doesn't have to. What it can do, given enough patience and the right kind of support, is prove itself steady enough, day after ordinary day, that the people who love us eventually have no real choice but to believe it. If you or someone you know is struggling with self-harm or difficult thoughts, please know that support exists and you deserve care. In the United States, you can reach the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by calling or texting 988, available 24 hours a day. You can also reach the crisis text line by texting HOME to 741-741. If you're outside the US, please look up your country's local crisis support line. Thank you for sitting with this one. I'll see you in the next story.